so this pole to equator temperature gradient, which is existing in the North Atlantic between the autumn through the winter and into the spring months, means that the temperature changes very rapidly over a few thousand kilometres. What the global circulation and what the individual weather systems are trying to do is break down that temperature gradient by taking warm air northwards and cold air southwards, so that the tropics don't keep getting warmer and the polar regions keep getting colder. And the way that the individual weather systems work is that they work a bit like a wave developing on the ocean surface and travelling towards a beach. And I guess we've all sat on the beach and watched waves come towards us, and as they approach the beach they get bigger and bigger until they finally break. And weather systems do the same kind of thing. We've got a little schematic diagram here showing a small wave on this boundary between the warm air and cold air. And what happens when that small wave starts to form is that it amplifies. The wave gets bigger and bigger. The bulge of warm air pushing northwards gets larger, and it's followed by a big bulge of cold air swirling around behind it. There's northward movement of the warm air and southward movement of the cold air, until eventually the wave breaks. And the wave breaks by cutting off a large pool of warm air on the cold side of the polar front boundary, and a large blob of cold air gets stranded on the warm side of the polar front boundary. So that's quite an effective way that the weather system takes warm air towards the cold direction and cold air towards the warm direction. So this kind of thing is happening almost all the time during the autumn, winter and spring months. And what I've got here is an animation of the temperature of the atmosphere across the North Atlantic sector through one particular week in January of 2009. And what you're seeing on the screen is a map of the temperature of the atmosphere, and the yellow and green colours are showing fairly warm air, and the blue and purple colours are showing fairly cold air. And during the sequence, as it runs, you'll see a whole succession of waves developing on the boundary between the warm and cold air, as individual weather systems pull warm air northwards and pull cold air southwards down behind them. And you'll see eventually pools of warm air being stranded on the cold side of the temperature boundary, and pools of cold air being stranded on the warm side of the temperature boundary. And that's effectively how these particular weather systems go about doing their job of mixing up the temperature and taking warm air towards the poles and cold air towards the equator. So on the big scale of things, effectively what weather systems are trying to do is pull warm air northwards and cold air southwards and even out the temperature gradient that we see in the North Atlantic. But that doesn't explain the kind of more detailed structure of weather systems that we've come to understand, the frontal zones, the bands of rain, the circulation patterns and the rising and sinking of air. So to understand weather systems in a little bit more detail, we perhaps need to zoom in on an individual weather system and look at the kind of sequence of events that occur during its life cycle. And I have a set of figures here which again are fairly typical figures from a geography or a meteorology textbook showing the life cycle of a depression. And what we're seeing here is that the surface pressure is mapped in the black lines or isobars, and the surface fronts, the boundaries between the warm air and the cold air, are shown in their typical pattern of a red line showing the warm front and a blue line showing the cold front. What we see as the depression goes through its life cycle is that the originally small wave gradually becomes more and more pronounced until the system is very well wrapped up with another front appearing on the diagram, which is the occluded front, shown by a purple line. And it's not so easy to understand what that occluded front means and where it comes from. So in the next little while we're going to look at how a weather system goes through its life cycle, what happens to it in a little bit more detail, and try and understand the evolution of the frontal systems that we actually see in individual weather systems. At this stage, it's probably a good idea to start thinking about weather systems in 3 dimensions. So far we've been looking at maps of weather systems looking down from above, which gives the impression that weather systems are rather flat. It's very important to remember that they have a 3rd dimension as well, which is height. And this dimension is absolutely crucial to the formation of weather systems, and particularly the cloud and rain, because all the cloud and rain that's associated with an individual weather system is caused by air rising. As air rises, it cools, the water vapour that's in it starts to condense and starts to form cloud. And it's that cloud that then forms rain, and it's the rain that we probably notice most as a weather system passes over us. So what we're going to look at now is some cross-sections in the vertical through an individual weather system. So on the screen now we have a weather map from the earlier sequence that we've looked at, and then we're going to look at a cross-section through that weather map along the brown line that's on the screen, which crosses to the south of the centre of the depression, crossing the cold front and the warm front. And so looking in cross-section with height going up the page and horizontal distance going along the page now, we see that as we cut through the cold front and the warm front, those boundaries between the warm air and the cold air aren't completely vertical. They slope, the warm front sloping forwards as the system's moving from left to right on our figure, and the cold front in this case sloping backwards. And most of the vertical motion that's going on within weather systems is happening at these frontal boundaries as the warm air rises up the frontal boundary of the warm front and the cold front. And as I've already described, rising air leads to condensation, condensation leads to cloud and eventually rain, and so distinct bands of cloud tend to form in these areas of rising motion on the warm front and the cold front. Now, if we go a little bit further through the life cycle of a depression now and look at a cross-section through a rather more mature system, we're now looking at, again, a cross-section along the brown line, just to the south of the centre of the depression, through the occluded front. And what we see now is that the warm sector, this blob of warm air that's contained between the warm front and cold front, has now been lifted off the ground and is completely above the surface. So the occlusion, the surface front that marks the occluded front, is actually a boundary between the cold air ahead of the system and the cold air behind the system. And distinct frontal bands that were associated with the warm front and the cold front now rather merged into a single mass of cloud, which is associated with the occluded front.